Between 5,000 and 4,400 years ago, before the flood, the earth seemed like a garden without seasons. Moisture didn't fall as rain, it hung in the air. But that calm hid a system about to break from the inside. The antediluvian world, according to ancient traditions, worked like a greenhouse. A vapor layer high above trapped heat and kept everything humid without violent storms. It looked perfect. But constant perfection creates excess, and excess eventually becomes an unavoidable threat. Plants didn't grow well, they grew too much. Ferns became trees, trunks rose until they vanished into the haze, roots lifted the ground. Light arrived filtered and diffused, as if the sky had a permanent veil. It was beautiful and oppressive. Walking alone through that forest meant entering a scale not made for you. Some trunks were so wide an entire family could hide inside. Harvesting fruit required ropes and teamwork. The world offered abundance, but demanded organization just to survive. And then came the simplest warning of terror. The ground trembled. It wasn't an earthquake. It was living weight. Enormous herds crossed clearings, grazing like machines. The air's smell changed when they arrived, turned earth and hot dung. Texts like the Book of Job describe Behemoth as an untamable force. Many see there a memory of colossal creatures, giant herbivores. The name doesn't matter. Imagine living alongside 20 tons of muscle that decides to pass near your home. Danger didn't come only from the ground. The sky had predators too. Giant birds of prey and winged creatures circled rivers and villages. A distracted child was a real risk. That's why roofs were reinforced, fires built high, and sentries became routine. Night wasn't rest. It was strategy. Even so, that world still felt normal compared to what came next.
Because one day, people began seeing lights descending from the sky. Not like chaotic meteors, like controlled, intentional movements aimed at cities and inhabited places. And that changed the shape of fear. Those lights didn't land in secret. They arrived like they had rights. Apocryphal traditions call these beings watchers. They stepped into public squares, looked at crowds, and spoke like owners. Their presence was an order without words. Their height shocked first, 8 feet, maybe more. But what broke your mind was the sense of another nature. Skin with a faint glow, eyes that seemed to hold light. And the most invasive part, they knew names, histories, family secrets no one had ever spoken aloud. They came with gifts, and gifts are the oldest bait for control. Seeds that sprouted faster, metalworking techniques no one possessed, star maps, medicinal plants, formulas, and measurements.
It was as if knowledge was poured into the world at once, without maturity. This download of technology didn't happen slowly. Tradition describes specific teachers. One teaches blades and shields, another teaches enchantments, another teaches astrology. The result is simple. One generation leaps centuries in capability. And when capability grows without character, violence gets an engine. But they didn't ask for gold as payment. They asked for access to the human body. Genesis 6 describes, in a few lines, a brutal taking. They took women for themselves. It's not romance, it's possession. Families watched helplessly as daughters were chosen, and the world learned that power has appetite. Then biology changed. Traditions say pregnancies became violent, heavy, abnormal. Midwives sensed at birth that this wasn't fully human. Babies too large, too strong, too hungry. And hunger in this kind of story always becomes a symbol of something worse.
Growth was accelerated, almost absurd. Within months, they walked. Within a few years, they broke things without meaning to. Not from innocence, but from power. When strength arrives before empathy, everything around becomes fragile toys, and fragile people become things. Society began to tremble. The most disturbing detail isn't size, it's mind. These hybrids, called Nephilim in some traditions, are described as quick to learn and slow to feel. They understood rules but despised limits. A human father can't command a son who can crush a door with his hands. When they reached maturity, they didn't want to be sons. They wanted to be kings. Imagine rulers gigantic in stature, with charisma and force, and no court above them. There was no police to restrain them. Their word was law. And law in this setting means tribute, fear, and silent disappearances. Cities, once built for protection against predators, became fortresses of oppression.
Thick walls, controlled gates, guards loyal to the giant. Heavy tribute, grain, livestock, metal, women. People surrendered to survive one more day. Survival became a political currency. Tradition also describes a culture of renown, untouchable heroes, celebrated champions, status figures. Fame becomes a mask for cruelty. Those who question, vanish. Those who resist become examples. And when fear becomes atmosphere, you begin calling tyranny order. But there's an impossible logistical problem: hunger. How do you feed giants? First, they consume harvests, then herds, then game. And when everything grows scarce, the world looks at the last source of meat still available. That's when the story becomes pure horror. Ancient traditions speak of cannibalism and public rituals, altars where human lives were sacrificed as if they were resources. The horror wasn't hidden. It was displayed to educate fear. Children grew up watching, learning that people are disposable.
An entire generation was trained in dehumanization. Genesis uses a strong word to describe the earth: violence. Not a fight, raw oppression, systemic injustice, constant bloodshed. There were no good days, only pauses. When cruelty becomes routine, conscience dies quietly. And a world without conscience always invents excuses. While the hybrids ruled, their fathers kept teaching secrets. War stopped being a tool and became an industry. Better blades, armor, siege techniques. Conflicts multiplied. It wasn't local dispute anymore. It was armed escalation driven by knowledge humanity wasn't ready to hold. And it wasn't only war. It was seduction as method. Ornaments, cosmetics, polished metals, shine. Things that seem small but alter collective behavior. Vanity becomes a system. Appearance becomes currency. And when appearance becomes currency, truth loses value. A superficial society is a manipulable society. Sorcery, or pharmakia, enters as another layer.
Substances and rituals to alter consciousness, break inner limits, open mental doors. You can call it myth, symbol, or memory. The narrative effect is clear. Humanity seeks inner power without morality, and chaos gains mysticism. Astrology appears as a replacement of authority. Instead of looking to the Creator, people look to movements of the sky to decide life. That reorganizes priorities. Creation becomes worship. When you worship signs, you obey fear, and fear always demands more control, more blood, more ritual. Music changes too. Instead of simple song, it becomes constant noise in the cities. Long festivals, repetitive rhythms, distraction as anesthesia. An anesthetized society doesn't think, and whoever doesn't think accepts. Technology, pleasure, and violence become a perverse trinity holding up the same empire. This world creates two humanities. On one side, walled cities, metal, spectacle, and worship of the powerful.
On the other, groups trying to live simply, intense, preserving memory of Eden and calling on the name of the Lord. The separation wasn't only geographic, it was moral and psychological. The biblical tradition speaks of Cain building the first city. The city becomes a symbol of autonomy without God, progress without limits. Inside, forges, commerce, status, cult prostitution, and worship of power. Outside, people living with little,
trying to preserve humanity, and the boundary between them was fragile. That boundary broke when desire defeated holiness. Men who once resisted looked at the city shine and came down. They married, mixed, absorbed habits. It wasn't a single event, it was a leak. And when the leak happens, evil stops being over there and becomes in here. Genesis says, every imagination of the heart was only evil continually. That's a verdict of collective collapse. It means the social mind no longer produces spontaneous good. Evil becomes default. And when evil becomes default, even those who think they're good begin justifying small cruelties to survive. There's a strange phrase in Genesis 6, all flesh had corrupted its way. Some read it only as moral. Others see something broader, corruption of life itself, mixture, deformation. Extra-biblical texts expand this in language of mixing seeds. If you translate that into modern terms, it sounds like biological engineering. For the ancients, it was breaking the barriers of creation, hybrid creatures, unstable, out of place. Myths of chimeras and centaurs might be fantasy or distorted memory. The script's point is the same. The ecosystem went mad. When the ecosystem goes mad, the food chain collapses. Too many predators, too many prey, constant suffering. Nature becomes a laboratory without ethics. And in a world like that, the flood looks less like rage and more like a reset, a brutal cleansing to save what remained intact.
But before the water came the poetry of blood. Lamech, descendant of Cain, boasts of killing for a wound, for a shove. It's the first recorded poem, a poem about murder. When killing becomes song, culture has already died, and dead culture produces only multiplied violence. Bodies in the streets, armed clans, private justice. There was no state, there was force. And when force becomes rule, it demands spectacle to maintain itself. Human life loses price. Women become trophies. Children become resources. Empathy evaporates. Without empathy, humanity becomes a consuming machine. Then something physical begins to change. The sky, once stable, darkens. The air chills. People feel their own breath condense, something they had never seen. The vapor layer fails. For the first time, heavy clouds gather. A world that never saw storms looks up without vocabulary. The first thunder isn't just sound, it's trauma. A new roar tearing across the horizon.
Fear changes shape, and then the first drop falls. Not a gentle drizzle, a drop that announces the old rules are over. The earth that felt like a greenhouse begins to become judgment. Genesis describes the moment with two fronts, the windows of heaven and the fountains of the great deep. Water from above, water from below. Imagine the ground splitting, subterranean pressure exploding, rivers rising fast. Those who trusted walls discover walls also trap water. Cities become snares. At first, some try to laugh. It's only water. Others run to stone palaces, trusting engineering. But water doesn't negotiate. It rises in minutes, invades valleys, swallows streets. What was a symbol of power becomes a deadly aquarium. What was safety becomes a prison. Panic becomes a collective sound. In the middle of it, there is a strange object, a massive wooden box built by an old man named Noah. Decades of ridicule, decades of hammering. While the world had metal and magic, he had obedience and measurements. When the water rises, what looked like madness becomes the only logic that works. The door shuts. That detail is crucial. Shutting means final separation. Outside, technology, renown, violence, and pride. Inside, silence, animals, fear, and hope. The rain isn't only water, it is the erasure of an entire civilization, so complete it later becomes myth on survivors' tongues. And when the water finally dominates everything, the sound changes.
The noise of city, forge, party, and screaming disappears. Only wind and waves remain. For those who believe the narrative, this is history's reset. For those who don't, it is still a powerful symbol. When the world breaks, arrogance sinks first. The antediluvian script always ends with a warning. What destroyed that world wasn't only external violence, but internal corruption. Knowledge without character, power without limits, desire without brakes.
The flood is the logical end of a system that can no longer sustain human life. Now, if you want to turn this into a series, the next natural episode is how the ark worked inside. Dimensions, food, ventilation, routine, survival. And then, the world after the flood, because a reset doesn't erase memory, it only changes the landscape. Comment now, history comes to life, if you want this saga in connected episodes. And tell me, do you want us to explore the Watchers first, the Nephilim, or the forbidden technology? The next detail is going to get darker. And before you go, hold this image. A planet too green, too big, too strong. A sky that never rained. Lights descending like a decision. A world believing nothing could bring it down until the first drop fell and no one even had a name for what was coming. If you understood the logic of the terror, you understood the hidden moral. The problem was never only the monster. It was the normalization of the monster.
Calling oppression order, vanity culture, sorcery science, blood spectacle. When everything becomes normal, the end arrives without surprise. That's why this story survives, because it isn't only past, it's a mirror. The antediluvian age, read as myth or memory, screams the same question. What happens when humanity accelerates power but delays conscience? In the script, the answer is water, a lot of water.